Hello. Hi, everybody. Hi, good afternoon. Thanks to all of y'all for coming out today on such a beautiful day to celebrate the opening of not one, but two great Dixon-originated exhibitions, Countess de Castiglione, The Allure of Creative Self-Absorption, and William McGregor Paxton and Elizabeth Okie Paxton, an artistic partnership. We are really so proud of both of these exhibitions and their accompanying publications, both for sale at the very reasonable price of $30 each in the shop, because both of these exhibitions tell stories that really needed to be told. And we chose just the right people to help us tell both of those stories. So we're here today to talk about the Paxtons. The Paxtons is the product of over 4 years of hard work by our speaker today, Jane Ward Faquin. Jane conceived of and advocated for this project, researched every aspect of the lives of Elizabeth and William Paxton, Bill and Betty, and found each and every work in this exhibition and helped to negotiate their loans. She is also the sole author of our beautiful Paxton catalog that I hope y'all will check out. It's really great, and I'm sure Jane would be happy to sign copies if you'd like. So just a little bit about Jane, for those of you who don't know her. Jane Ward Faquin is an independent curator and art historian from Memphis who has a special interest in American and French Impressionism. In 2014, she curated our highly successful Charles Courtney Curran, Seeking the Ideal, which ultimately led to the Dixon acquiring one of the works in the show, the Evening Illuminations at the Paris Exposition, which is on view in the Dixon residence in the foyer, I think, right now. And everybody loves that painting. And we wouldn't have really had it in the building in the first place if it weren't for Jane. A few years earlier, in 2010, she was the force behind our Helen M. Turner, The Woman's Point of View, spotlighting New Orleans artist Helen Turner. Before becoming a freelance curator, Jane was the curator of education at the Dixon here for 15 years. So that's how I'm sure a lot of us first got to know Jane. But before that, she coordinated the volunteer effort for the Ramses the Great Wonders exhibition for the Junior League of Memphis, which at the time was the largest volunteer effort ever in Tennessee. And I think her co-chair is here today, for that. And then even before that, before joining the museum world, Jane taught history, English, and art history at several area high schools, including teaching my husband, Ronald. Jane holds a BA and MA degrees from the University of South Carolina. She has also judged a number of juried art shows in West Tennessee and Eastern Arkansas, and she is a fourth-generation Arkansan. I didn't know that. Okay, so in addition to all these wonderful things, Jane is even more special to me because in 2005, she hired me as an intern here at the Dixon. And there are several staff members here and even some trustees who were once Jane's intern. And I know all of us, all of her former interns and co-workers and friends are so proud of the work that Jane has continued to do for the Dixon and for Memphis since her official retirement from having a desk and an office here. So I hope you all will join me today. I can't wait to hear what Jane has to say about the Paxton, so let's welcome her back to the stage here.
Thank you, Julie. It's great to be here today and to talk about the Paxtons. And before I get started, I wanted to first of all acknowledge the staff of the Dixon Gallery and Gardens, especially Director Kevin Sharp, who I think is here today, and Curator Julie Novri-Sperati. This is the third exhibition, which Julie mentioned, that I've organized and curated for them with the three of us really working together in three. And it marks over 30 years of my long association with the museum. I have enjoyed all of my varied experiences here. I also want to thank Dixon's registrar, Kristen Kimberling, for her assistance and attention to detail, and graphic designer Corky Sinks, who designed the catalog layout and with whom I worked closely on a myriad number of details for the publication. And speaking of the catalog, I especially want to thank the Arthur F. and Alice E. Adams Charitable Trust, who provided the major funding for it. They are represented right now in this area by Renee Gabow and her son Paul. I was also privileged to know Renee's mother, Mrs. Virginia Clark, who in years past also funded any number of musical programs here at the Dixon while I was the curator of education. And Mrs. Clark, of course, is sort of synonymous with the opera in Memphis, and the Clark Opera Center is named for her. Without their financial assistance, the catalog might not have been possible. I also want to recognize or acknowledge the Margaret Oates Dixon Society, whose I believe has 93 members who have contributed to the museum and to my exhibition. And finally, I want to thank the Joe Orgill Family Fund, who were major sponsors for the exhibition. Although Joe Orgill has passed away, his legacy to the museum continues. I have very happy memories of the time when Joe was chairman of the board of the Dixon, because it was during his tenure that we began Art to Grow in 2000, the mobile art education unit of the museum, which will be 20 years old next year, and has served as many as 200,000 children, I guess, in the Mid-South community with hands-on art and horticulture experiences. Despite my pride in creating this and the two earlier exhibitions that we talked about, the van is probably my most enduring legacy. Nonetheless, what we came here to talk about today is another legacy and partnership, that of the couple William McGregor Paxton and his wife and fellow painter Elizabeth Okie Paxton, who were married for 42 years and who shared their lives and their art. There was a major exhibition of William Paxton's work 40 years ago, which was organized by the Indianapolis Museum of Art. And Elizabeth Paxton's work has been discussed in relation to women artists of the Boston School. But there has never been an exhibition which examines their personal and artistic partnership. We hope to remedy that void with this exhibition. I have entitled my lecture, The Paxton's Women, because that's what their art was all about. Young female models who sat for most of the images you will see in the galleries and who were engaged in a variety of what were often considered domestic or feminine activities or pursuits. And here are two examples in the exhibition by William Paxton, on the left, which is called Morning Light, and on the right, The New Hat. Even the still life paintings in the show often reflect an unseen female presence, since many of them involve the kitchen and the bedroom. And I think it's pretty obvious here which is which. Although I suppose in today's climate, those traditional spheres might be challenged by many Me Too movement activists. But nonetheless, those are still important parts of every woman's life. Yet it's important to keep in mind that Bill and Betty Paxton, as they were known to their friends and most who knew them, were also living in a time of extreme change, particularly the place and role of women, both in the home and in the community. By the beginning of the 20th century, many women were furthering their education by attending high school and college, entering the professions, and eventually seeing the passage of the 19th Amendment, which finally gave all women over 21 the right to vote. It is important to note that as we discuss the Paxtons, some of these changing roles make subtle appearances in their pictures. And I think here are two good examples, both in the exhibition. On the left is a painting called The Letter, and on the right, The Visitor. And in these, as you can see, they are young women who are dressed up as if they are going out for the day or perhaps for the afternoon, perhaps to a women's suffrage meeting or perhaps to one of the myriad women's organizations which emerged in the U.S. Around the turn of the century. But before we jump too far ahead, Let us look at how the Paxtons met and how their differing backgrounds may have influenced their relationship. William McGregor Paxton was the cherished only child of middle-class parents who ran a successful bakery and catering business in the Boston suburb of Newton. Paxton's father had little formal education, and it is likely that Rose Paxton, whose parents had immigrated from Ireland 50 years before, assisted her husband in establishing the business. And here we see a very young Bill Paxton, as you can see. My husband thought it was a girl. Was I sure that was Bill Paxton? I assured him that a long time ago, little boys wore dresses just like girls did. Bill attended public school in the suburb and showed an early talent and interest in art. While still in high school, his parents allowed him to become a student at the Cowles Art School in Boston under the tutelage of Impressionist Dennis Miller Bunker. And the photograph on the right was probably taken while he was a student at the Cowles Art School. Bunker was so impressed with Paxton's talent that he urged the young man to continue his studies in Paris, then the center of the art world. Paxton left for the French capital in 1889 and continued his studies first at the Académie Julian and later at the prestigious government-sponsored and all-male École des Beaux-Arts. There, he became a student of Léon Gérôme, an important academic painter whose emphasis on the human figure, technique, and painting what the artist saw rather than how he saw it, as the Impressionists might have done, became the basis for much of Paxton's own work. And here are two works by Gérôme, actually in American collections. On the left is a painting called The Roman Slave Market, and on the right, it's called Artist in His Studio, and that may actually be Gérôme as the model for the artist. And Gérôme was particularly noted for putting his figures in classical or exotic locales. But unlike Gérôme, who, as I said, placed his figures in classical or exotic places, Paxton preferred the Impressionist demand for scenes from modern life. Also, like many of his contemporaries, he was enamored with both Asian art objects and the aesthetics of Japanese art, albeit in a well-to-do middle-class setting. And here are two paintings in the exhibition by Paxton which sort of illustrate that. On the left-hand side is a still life by Paxton, which of course is a collection of Asian objects. And on the right, a young woman consulting a book, and if you'll notice, she's dressed in a Chinese robe, and behind her is a very large Asian, either Japanese or Chinese urn. William Paxton stayed in Paris for 4 years, returning to Boston in 1893, where shortly thereafter he met the beautiful teenager Elizabeth Okie, who had persuaded her parents to allow her to attend the Cowles Art School, where Paxton soon became a junior instructor. And these are two images of Bill Paxton. On the left, I love the romantic photograph which he had taken shortly after his return from Paris in the guise of an artist, for sure. And on the right, he was at that point a rather poor and starving artist. And that's a self-portrait that he did that was supposedly done with house paint. Elizabeth, or Betty, had grown up in a very different socioeconomic group from Paxton. Born in Providence, Rhode Island, both her father and grandfather were successful Harvard-trained physicians, and her father had studied medicine in Germany during the Civil War. Her mother's family were stockbrokers and bankers. In the early 1890s, Howard Okie moved his family and his medical practice to Boston. While her attractive mother participated in the social rounds of well-to-do Bostonians, her father seemed to have spent a good bit of time away from his family, even traveling abroad at least twice for several months without them. Betty also had a younger sister, Adele. And here we see a photograph of Betty's mother in the center and Betty on the left, and you can see she bore a striking resemblance to her mother, and on the right, her younger sister, Adele. According to an interview with William Paxton in 1927, both girls were educated at home, presumably with a governess, and that sort of tells us the sort of socioeconomic group that they belong to. And while Betty showed an interest in art, her sister seems to have had considerable musical talent. Unfortunately for modern scholars, myself included, Betty left no written record about her family or about her education. What we know today comes from secondhand sources, the U.S. Census, newspapers, Ancestry.com, and a scrapbook that she gave to the Archives of American Art along with her husband's edited papers. As hard as it is to believe, among those documents, there are no letters between the couple and no photos of them together. Obviously, Betty Paxton remained throughout her life a very private person, and that has continued into posterity. But despite her shyness, Bill Paxton soon became enamored with the beautiful 16-year-old who was almost 9 years his junior. He was aided in his quest by a fellow artist and Cal's teacher, Joseph DeCamp, who was a friend of Bill Paxton's and who is said to have played Cupid for the couple. Before long, Betty became her suitor's muse and eventually his favorite model for the next decade, the first of his women. In 1899, just a few months before Elizabeth's 21st birthday, the couple finally married in a simple ceremony in Boston. It seems likely that their differing social backgrounds and the fact that artists often had a somewhat precarious financial future, that may account for their long courtship. There is no record of either set of parents attending the wedding. On the left is Paxton's official wedding portrait of Elizabeth, and on the right is a later picture of Elizabeth in a traditional wedding gown, which we assume was either borrowed or rented. The 1899 picture of Elizabeth in the straw hat is the picture that we chose for the cover of the catalog. Here it is, right here. Shortly thereafter, the newlyweds moved in with Bill's parents in Newton. Thus began the domestic routine that the couple followed for most of their marital life. William maintained a studio in Boston, commuting there daily, and Betty stayed home, although she must have visited his studio often to pose during that first decade. This double portrait of Betty and Adele recalls the grand portraits which wealthy Bostonians might have seen abroad and was a wonderful showcase for Bill Paxton's talent as a portrait painter, and which eventually became his steadiest art income. It's also, if you see it in the galleries, the largest painting in the exhibition. A second painting, called The Red Fan, or sometimes Woman with a Fan, is another life-size image of his wife, which is in the exhibition, and shows particularly off Bill's ability to render fine fabrics and beautiful details. You might note the fabric on the chairs, the brocade, and also the lace on her negligee or robe that she is wearing. Summers for the couple were usually spent in a number of New England watering holes and artist colonies, particularly Gloucester, which was very, very popular, and later Provincetown, which is still known today as an artist colony, where the Paxtons eventually purchased a summer cottage. Early in Bill Paxton's career, he also painted a number of Impressionist figural studies outdoors in bright sunshine. Two such paintings are seen here from 1904. On the left is the White Veranda, which is in the exhibition, and is really a most interesting painting. And on the right, a painting which I have fallen in love with, but I could not find anywhere. There were 2 or 3 pictures that we searched and searched for and just weren't able to locate. And this one is called Sun, Sea, and Breeze. And Betty was most probably, the woman in both. Occasionally, the couple also went abroad. They seem to have taken an extended honeymoon in Italy in 1901, and again in 1907 and 1910 when they spent the summers in Venice. And on the left is a young Bill Paxton, actually in the ruins in Pompeii. And on the right is the kind of landscape which both Paxtons oftentimes completed in the summer and then donated or gave to friends sometimes. They seldom actually sold those pictures. And in that one, you see the figure in black in the foreground, and that is probably Betty Paxton. You may have noticed that so far, I have not talked at all about Betty Paxton's pictures. That is because either she took a hiatus from painting in the early years of her marriage, or they may have been destroyed in a disastrous studio fire in Boston in November of 1904, when her husband lost almost 100 canvases. She herself has left us no clue. Other possible reasons are more personal. Her father died of tuberculosis in 1902. Her mother-in-law in 1906, at home, possibly of complications from heart disease. Betty herself may have suffered the loss of a child, perhaps even twins, about the same time, although she never mentioned it later to anyone, since subjects like that were really taboo until the 1970s. Her husband left a short poem or limerick that he was very fond of writing to her that referenced twins, baby bottles, cribs, and safety pins, and which indicates that was certainly a possibility. The couple never had children. The first mention of exhibiting any of her work came in a short clipping about an exhibition by a Boston artist at Rowland's Gallery in 1907. And this is a good example from the scrapbook. She had this tiny clipping in there, but no source about where it had come from. And just recently, since I started to write my essay or my talk for today, I subscribed to the newspaper archive, and it popped up with where this was actually a clipping out of the Boston Globe. So you just never know when you're going to find the source that you're looking for. Many members of the Boston School exhibited their work at Rowland before World War I. I think it is quite possible that Betty returned to her painting as a way to get over these somewhat traumatic events. She set up a studio in her house in Newton and began to paint the ordinary objects she found in her own home, often items associated with women. The settings for many of these pictures appears to either be the kitchen or the bedroom. Most are small, few are dated, and they were all reasonably priced. On the left is a typical kitchen still life, which Betty probably painted in the teens or 20s. And on the right of the viewer, we see the objects that might be found on a woman's dressing table in her bedroom. Both of these pictures are in the exhibition. All exhibit a wonderful sense of color and show that Betty, too, had a talent for creating realistic scenes which capture a moment in time. She kept up with her sales and expenses in a series of handwritten pocket-sized diaries, one of which is in the Archives of American Art at the Smithsonian. And here you see a page of that. And at the top, you might see it says Pennsylvania Academy 1907. And those are the paintings that she exhibited there. And below that, you see National Academy of Design. And those were the paintings she exhibited that year there. And if you wonder where I got this, a young lady who I actually met sort of on the internet, who was also interested in Paxton and doing some Paxton research, actually went to the Smithsonian, to the Archives of American Art, took digital photographs of everything and then sent them to me on a flash drive. So I have some wonderful images and so forth that I was able to get, and I thank her in the catalog because she really, she gave me access to things that I wouldn't have been able to get otherwise. While Betty seems to have almost always worked from home, Bill Paxton created most of his work in a series of studios. There he could entertain his clients, interview potential models, and interact with other members of the so-called Boston School, of which he was a member. Other prominent figures and friends of the group included American Impressionists Edmund Tarbell, Frank Benson, and Joseph DeCamp, all of whom at various times pictures of theirs have been shown here at the Dixon, as well as another good friend and critic, Philip Leslie Hale. All of them, at some time, were associated with the Museum Art School attached to the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. And here is a picture from 1913. That was when Bill Paxton resigned, and he is actually seated there in the hat on the front row. And those are, you'll notice most of them are women, although not all. And they were sort of, some of them were very upset when he resigned, and so they had a sort of a protest, you might say, in front of the museum building. All of these members of the Boston School were also influenced by the domestic interiors created in the 17th century by the Dutch artists, particularly those of Jan Vermeer. And here are two paintings by Vermeer. On the left, a woman reading a letter, and on the right, women with balance. All of these men had studied abroad and had seen some of these pictures firsthand. And actually, there's one in Boston at the Isabel Stewart Gardner Museum. Hale actually wrote a book about Vermeer, which was published in 1913, which Paxton helped him to edit. Like the Dutch, these artists created scenes that feature women doing a variety of domestic chores or enjoying leisure activities, which included music, reading, sewing, paying calls. And here are 4 pictures. I thought you might like to see the kind of work his contemporaries were doing. On the left is Joseph DeCamp's painting called The Violinist, and on the right, an interior scene by Edmund Tarbell of his family, who he often painted. This was at their summer home in New Hampshire. And then again on the left, a painting by Frank Benson of his daughters, who he often painted outdoors. And on the right, a painting by Philip Leslie Hale. Paxton, who by this time mainly worked indoors, now relied on models, both professional and amateur, after Betty didn't want to pose anymore. And he also created a series of pictures which feature domestic servants. On the left is a painting from the collection of the Pennsylvania Academy, which is in the exhibition, which is called Girl Sweeping. And that picture had been so popular, the Pennsylvania Academy purchased it from him shortly after its exhibition. He did a second version, which is also called Girl Sweeping, smaller version, the following year. And here are 2 more. The kitchen maid on the left, and on the right, the housemaid, which is part of the National Gallery. And originally we were going to be able to get that painting for the exhibition, but then they notified us that they were using it on the cover of their day book. And so they have a policy that if that's the case, they don't want it to be out of the museum for any reason, and so they had to turn us down. But we did use it as a comp image in the catalog. The phrase "make it like" has often been applied to Boston artists, meaning they sought to create real-life domestic scenes. But perhaps a more apt phrase might instead be they wished to make it like they hoped it would be or how they wanted it to be. One recent female art historian says that Boston artists created sanitized spaces that ignored the realities of life for many women and their families. Ironically, most of these artists found their professional models in these same working-class immigrant families, although like Paxton, they also used their wives and children in their pictures. But domestic life was not always perfect, and here's an example of one in the exhibition. This is Paxton's picture of the breakfast, and here the young wife turns away from her husband, who appears oblivious to her mood as he is hidden behind the morning paper. Is she rejecting the typical role of the middle-class wife, or is she brooding about that attractive servant in the composition? Paxton leaves the decision to the viewer. Betty Paxton's painting, The Open Window, seen here on the left, which depicts a young woman working at a sewing machine. It stands in sharp contrast to her husband's and his friends' depictions of young women sewing or knitting, and that's Bill Paxton's painting, which is also in the exhibition, which is called Woman Sewing, and it belongs to the Detroit Institute of Arts, and it's in the show. This painting by Betty, I think, implies that a woman knew a great deal more about the reality of sewing and creating a garment than did the male members of the Boston School. After Betty retired as a regular model, Bill relied on a series of young women, both professional and amateurs, to people his scenes. The earliest was from 1908. Her identity remains a mystery, although in one contemporary account she's referred to as a Virginia Belle, but I was never able to identify her. Although she appears to have borne a striking resemblance to his wife. And in fact, in one picture, which is actually this young lady, some people have mistaken and thought it was a picture of Betty Paxton. She modeled for at least 3 pictures and possibly several more. Here we see a pair of companion pictures which Paxton did of her in 1908, wearing the identical evening gown. On the left is the painting in the exhibition, which is called Sylvia, and it is part of the permanent collection of the Butler Institute of American Art. The Butler is celebrating its centennial this year, and the Paxton exhibition will be part of the celebration later this summer. On the left is its companion, Girl with a Pearl Necklace, which created quite a sensation, and actually there were several articles written about the two of them at the time by various critics. At about the same period, Paxton began to employ a young Scottish immigrant who would become his favorite model during the next decade. Elizabeth Jane Young was her name, or Lizzie as she's referred to. Unlike the brunette in Sylvia, the blue-eyed strawberry blonde bore no resemblance to his wife. This small pastel, which is in the exhibition, may be the earliest image of her. Paxton went on to paint her at least 25 times. These two works in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum and the Museum of Fine Arts Boston are also early pictures where she appeared. The picture on the left is in the Museum of Fine Arts Boston collection, and she's the figure standing in the dark dress on the right-hand side. And the other picture, Tea Leaves, I'm not convinced that she is in that picture, but the Met says that she is. So that she is the figure standing with her back to us. Both of these works also display a technique which was unique to Paxton, binocular vision. Simply put, in these elaborate compositions, and you'll see how many elements there are in these pictures, while the main figure or model in the picture is usually in sharp focus and very much delineated, as you can see the girl in pink on the left and the girl in white on the right, they are very much in sharp focus. The other elements, and also the other figures, appear in a softer focus, or sort of fuzzy, if you will, around the edges. Two other works in the exhibition which feature Lizzie are The Other Room on the left and Rose and Blue on the right. And the other room particularly is reminiscent of Vermeer, because where you look through into another room is a technique which the Dutch often used. Note that in these two dresses, which again reappear in numerous times, one pink and one blue, she wears those same costumes at least in 4 or 5 other pictures. And there's one in the exhibition where actually she is wearing both. She's the model for both of the figures, and in one she has on the pink, one of the figures seated, she's wearing the blue dress, standing, she's wearing the pink dress, so you might take a note of it. She's also the model in The Breakfast that we had just seen, and one of my favorite paintings in the exhibition, The Morning Paper. Here, Lizzie reads the daily paper wearing a Japanese robe and slippers, which again reappears several times in the exhibition, and is enjoying a solitary breakfast, in particular a cup of coffee, in her bedroom. The breakfast tray, which you see sort of in the foreground on the right-hand side, is an image which reappears in at least 5 other Paxton pictures, 2 by Bill and 3 by Betty. It first appears in a painting in the exhibition from 1910 called Dejeuner Venice, which we assume Bill Paxton painted while he was in Italy that summer. And this is an unknown model, perhaps actually the servant who that they had while they were in Venice. A year later, Betty would employ the tray in 3 works: Breakfast to Bed, Continental Breakfast, and perhaps her best-known picture, the breakfast tray, seen here. And actually, I think this one, the actual composition of the picture may have come from a painting by John Singer Sargent that she might have been familiar with from the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston, because it was in their collection. And then here we see 2 more breakfasts. On the left, Continental Breakfast by Betty, and on the right, a painting in the exhibition, which is Bill Paxton's recreation of a breakfast tray. And I think surely this repetition of an image indicates a subtle rivalry between the husband and wife. But returning to Paxton's model, Lizzie Young, she married in 1917 and appears to have given up posing after she got married. Instead, Bill Paxton began to use another young woman named Edna Blanchard, who appears in the exhibition in the left in a painting called The Figurine from the National Museum of American Art. And on the right, she may be the model in this painting, which is entitled Glitter, and which actually we only found out about or were able to get at the last minute into the exhibition. It's pretty significant for us because it is the only example in the exhibition of Paxton's work from the last decade of his career. Although many artists and collectors had moved on from the somewhat idealized feminine figures associated with American Impressionists by the 1920s, Paxton continued to paint attractive female figural works. He became something of a standard bearer for the traditional atelier method of study for serious artists, and often spoke out against more modern artistic styles that emerged after World War I. We have no record of what Betty thought of his outbursts or his critics, or his criticism of the critics. But it is interesting to note that her small still life pictures retain a timeless quality, while her husband's beautiful but somewhat passive depictions of women seem dated in modern context. No doubt today's militant feminists probably would not appreciate Bill Paxton's attitude and depictions of women. But nonetheless, I think many of us can appreciate the beauty in those pictures. The last important model whom Paxton employed was Elsa Evans Tashko, who was active in theater and art circles in the Boston area in the late 20s and early 30s. Paxton himself enjoyed performing in local dramatic events, particularly the humorous all-male revues by the Beachcombers Club in Provincetown. Elsa also bore a striking resemblance to Betty Paxton. He painted her at least 5 times, one of which you see here. This is in the collection of the Maryhill Museum in Washington State that I have to say I had never heard of until we began looking for Paxton pictures, and they actually have 5 in their collection. And we were very lucky to borrow, I think we borrowed 3 from them. He painted Elsa at least 5 times, as I said, and the 1979 Paxton catalog, which was the one produced by the Indianapolis Museum, compared his preoccupation with Tashko to Monet's with the Rouen Cathedral. She was 27 and he was 60. But whatever the relationship, it ended in 1939 when Paxton suffered a stroke. Although he continued to paint, after his illness, he too worked from home. In fact, Betty even resumed her role as a model, posing for all 3 of the figures in his last domestic interior, the living room seen here. And I do apologize for the quality of this slide. I tried to lighten it up and then I kind of got carried away, and when we blew it up it kind of lost something, and I apologize for that. But you can see the 3 figures, one her back to us in the foreground, we see the leg of one, and then we see one in the middle background on the right, and those are all Betty Paxton. He was actually working on this picture the day he died of heart failure in 1941. Now Betty Paxton assumed a new role in relation to her husband. She appears to have given up her own work as an artist in order to focus on Bill Paxton's artistic legacy, making sure that his work would not be forgotten in the midst of the modern trends which were taking over the arts community. Most of his male contemporaries in the Boston School by this time were dead. Her last major painting is probably At Auction, which was painted about 1940. We're not exactly sure. This grand still life features many of the objects found in her husband's work, including the tapestries, the Asian urns, the elaborate bric-a-brac and books. But the simple black umbrella, which you see in the foreground, tagged as if for sale, speaks to her duty as a widow to dispose of the bric-a-brac in her husband's studio. It may be the same umbrella which Paxton used in an early studio picture in the exhibition, in fact, the earliest picture by Paxton, which somehow escaped the 1904 fire, which may have been painted in Paris while he was a student. In this new role, Betty Paxton, with the assistance of her husband's friend and favorite student, a man named R.H. Ives Gamble, she assembled the paintings for a retrospective of her husband's work at the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston in 1941. And here we see a picture of Betty, which appeared in the Boston Herald covering the retrospective. And that is actually a painting of her from 1920, which Paxton did, again, another life-size picture called White and Gold. And the shoes, if you could see them up close, the shoes in this photograph actually may be the same shoes that appear in the still life picture, which is in the exhibition. She also helped put together a collection of her husband's drawings, which the St. Botolph Club in Boston exhibited in 1943, where Paxton was a longtime member. Overcoming her natural shyness and stepping into a new role, from the inventory left in her husband's estate, she continued to manage both the financial and artistic sides of William McGregor Paxton's career. In 1967, she negotiated a large exhibition of her husband's work in the Richard Graham Gallery in New York City. She was 89 years old. About the same time, she sold her home in Newton. Her sister had just died, and I often wonder if that had something to do with it, and moved to the place in Boston where Bill Paxton had produced some of his finest pictures and where she posed for him many times, the Fenway Studio building in Boston. And it was the first building in America which was designed exclusively to be used as studios and apartments, and it still exists today. It's still used for the same purpose. And this is actually a change of address, if you will, or perhaps a card which she sent out to friends, which is a line drawing of her studio. And you can see the huge windows on one side and the balcony. And there she is, I suppose a slightly younger version of her, in front of the easel. Just a few years after this move to the Fenway Studio, Elizabeth Paxton died in 1972 at the age of 94. Few people in Boston or in the larger arts community noticed her passing. They really didn't notice because until I did some research for this exhibition, most people thought she died in 1971, and she actually died in 1972. Few people in Boston or in the larger arts community noticed. She had no close relatives, and the output of American Impressionists at that time was out of favor. Like most married women in the first half of the 20th century, she usually deferred to her husband in most instances outside the domestic sphere, and so she was viewed only in context as a wife. And like many women artists, her work was largely ignored or forgotten. Now, in the 21st century, many of these feminine figures are being rediscovered. In 2000, there was a major retrospective of women artists from the Boston area, which included Elizabeth Okie Paxton. Many years before, a fellow artist, Maria Dewing, again a person that nobody really looked at except in context, she's the wife of the American tonalist and impressionist Thomas Wilmer Dewing. She told Betty that her still life paintings compared favorably with greats like the 18th century French artist Chardin. Surely that's proof of her timeless appeal. From comments and clippings by friends and critics alike, it is evident that Bill Paxton was gregarious and outgoing. He loved baseball, enjoyed sailing and boxing, and offered his opinions on a wide variety of subjects, sometimes unsolicited. He was also a joiner, belonging to numerous arts and social clubs, including the Beachcombers that I had earlier mentioned, the National Arts Club, the Copley Society, and the St. Botolph clubs in Boston. And he also loved to play around. He had lots of friends. On the left is a photograph of him from 1908. We know it's 1908 from the picture that is actually painting there, and that's in Provincetown on the pier. And on the right, I love the painting. He's the one in the undershirt with the mustache on the far left. And actually, he was posing that summer. A sculptor named Charles Grafley was commissioned to do a series of busts of important American artists, and that is Grafley's wife, who's wrapped up in the drape as if they're clowning around about whether it's going to be a classical pose or not, I suppose. Except for the two paintings which you see here, we don't have many images of Betty. There are no photographs of her, as I had said earlier. Although she belonged to several arts organizations, including the Copley Society and the North Shore and Provincetown Art Associations, she was seldom in the limelight and seemed to have preferred it that way. There is no evidence that she was a suffragette or involved in many other women artists. Although we do see these pictures from 1913, which we think her husband may have painted on a summer trip to Hyannisport. There are almost no images of Betty after this time. It seems likely that she may have destroyed some photographs before giving them to the Paxton Papers or at the Smithsonian. And you may recognize, both of these are in the exhibition, and if you came in the gate, you may notice the picture on the left, which is called The Green Princess, or The Album. And that is Betty posing in a costume which first appeared, actually I think she had it made for a costume ball in Provincetown, and then I guess her husband liked it, and so she posed in this picture for it as well. There is only one painting of them together in the studio, which was painted by Bill Paxton in either 1904 or 1905, and it appears to have been greatly influenced by the studio picture of the famous 17th century Spanish court painter Diego Velázquez, Las Meninas. And there, that is Velázquez standing with his easel on the left-hand side of the composition. Paxton saw this picture on a trip to Spain in 1897. In Paxton's picture, Paxton stands at his easel in the right background of the composition. You can see him there. In the foreground, in a white dress, is his wife in sharp focus, but whose face is hidden from the viewer. Chin in hand, she contemplates the glowing fireplace that brightens the studio, but it is really Betty who lights up the image, the light in the picture, and by implication, she also lights up her husband's life. Among all the women that William Paxton painted over the years, society portraits, full-length nudes, domestic interiors, outdoor scenes, children, none held the same significance as those he created of his wife. Certainly, their relationship changed over the course of their 40-year marriage. But anyone who has been in such a long marriage can attest to this. I myself celebrated my 45th anniversary last week, and I can certainly say that. But Betty Paxton remained the chief figure in her husband's life, before and after his death. Look at the pictures in the exhibition, and you can see both the conscious and unconscious familiarity and positive attitude which both Paxton showed to the women who peopled their paintings. English art historian Francis Borzello, and I'll say Francis with an E-S, not an I-S, perhaps best described the kind of pictures that Paxton and his wife created. Modest paintings which radiate peace, privacy, and calm by artists who think, who dream, and who value the world they see from their windows. Thank you.